Chapter 3. In 1824, in consequence of the favourable report of Surveyor Oxley, a penal settlement was formed at Moreton Bay, but it was speedily removed to a better site on the Brisbane River, where the capital of Queensland now stands. The natives bestowed upon the abandoned settlement the name of Umpibong, literally dead houses, which name is still preserved as Humpibong. In 1825, Major Lockyer made a long boat excursion up the Brisbane River, and the stream being somewhat swollen by floods, he was able to penetrate, according to his own account, nearly 150 miles. He was much taken with the promising nature of the country, both on the Brisbane and its tributary, the Bremer, and great hopes, happily fulfilled, were entertained of the success of the new settlement. During this year, Mr. Cunningham had undertaken another journey to Liverpool Plains. Threading the pass he had formerly discovered and named Pandora's Pass, he crossed the plains, and ascended and examined the tableland to the north, returning to Bathurst. In 1827, this explorer, whose industry never flagged, started on the most eventful trip he ever made, destined to considerably affect the immediate progress of the new colony established at Moreton Bay. On the 30th of April, he left Segenhoe Station on the Upper Hunter, and, on crossing Oxley's 1818 track to Port Macquarie, at once entered on the unexplored northern region. On the 19th of May, after traversing a good deal of unpromising country, a fertile valley was entered, which led the travellers on to the banks of the Gwydir River, one of Cunningham's most important discoveries. He next found and named the Dumaresque River, and finally emerged on the beautiful plateau thenceforth known as the Darling Downs, where the Condamine River received its name after the governor's aide-de-camp. Cunningham's description of this tract of pastoral country is very glowing. Quote, "Deep ponds, supported by streams from the highlands immediately to the eastward, extend along their central lower flats. The lower grounds thus permanently watered present flats which furnish an almost inexhaustible range of cattle pasture at all seasons of the year, the grass and herbage generally exhibiting in the depth of winter an extreme luxuriance of growth. From these central grounds rise downs of a rich black and dry soil and very ample surface, and as they furnish abundance of grass and are conveniently watered, yet perfectly beyond the reach of those floods which take place on the flats in a season of rain, they constitute a sound and valuable sheep pasture." End quote. Here Cunningham halted for some time with the view of ascertaining the practicability of a passage across the range to Moreton Bay. In exploring the mountains immediately above the tents of the encampment, a remarkably excavated part of the main range was discovered, which appeared likely to prove available as a pass. Upon examination, the gap was found to be rugged and broken, partially blocked with fallen masses of rocks and overgrown by scrub and jungle. Beyond these impediments, which could soon be removed, the gap now known as Cunningham's Gap was apparently available as affording a descent to the lower coast lands. Relinquishing any further attempts for the present, either through the mountains or to the western interior, Cunningham returned to the Hunter, crossing and recrossing his outward track. He was absent all this expedition 13 weeks. The following year, the discoverer of the Darling Downs, accompanied by his old companion, Charles Fraser, colonial botanist, proceeded by sea to Moreton Bay with the intention of starting from the settlement and connecting with his camp on the Darling Downs by way of Cunningham's Gap. In this attempt, he was also accompanied by the Commandant, Captain Logan. The party followed up the Logan River and partly ascended Mount Lindsay, a lofty and remarkable mountain on the Dividing Range. They were, however, unsuccessful in finding the gap on this occasion. Cunningham, however, immediately started from Limestone Station on the Bremer, now the town of Ipswich, and this time was quite successful. On the 24th of August he writes, quote, About 1 o'clock we passed a mile to the southward of our last position, and entering a valley we pitched our tents within 3 miles of the gap we now suspected to be the pass of last year's journey. It's being early in the afternoon, I sent one of my people, who, having been one of my party on that long tour, knew well the features of the country lying to the westward of the dividing range, to trace a series of forest ridges which appeared to lead directly up to the foot of the hollowed back of the range. To my utmost gratification, he returned at dusk, having traced the ridge about 2.5 miles to the foot of dividing range, whence he ascended into the pass and, from a grassy head immediately above it, beheld the extensive country lying west of the main range. He recognised Darling and Canning Downs, patches of Peel's Plains, and several remarkable points of the forest hills on that side, fully identifying this hollow back with the pass discovered last year at the head of Miller's Valley, notwithstanding its very different appearance when viewed from the eastern country." End quote. The next day, accompanied by one man, Cunningham ascended the pass that bears his name. Following the ridges, they arrived in about 2 3/4 miles to the foot of the gap. Quote, "Immediately the summit of the pass appeared broad before us, bounded on each side by most stupendous heads towering at least 2,000 feet above it. Here the difficulties of the pass commenced. We had now penetrated to the actual foot of the pass without the smallest difficulty. It now remained to ascend by a steep slope to the level of its entrance. This slope is occupied by a very close wood, in which red cedar, sassafras, palms, and other ornamental intertropical trees are frequent. Through this shaded wood lie penetrated, climbing up a steep bank of a very rich, loose earth, in which large fragments of a very compact rock are embedded. At length we gained the foot of a wall of bare rock, which we found stretching from the southward of the pass. This face of naked rock we perceived, by tracing its course northerly, gradually to fall to the common level, so that, without the smallest difficulty, and to my utmost surprise, we found ourselves in the highest part of the pass, having fully ascertained the extent of the difficult part from the entrance into the wood to this point, not to exceed 400 yards." End quote. In this comparatively easy manner was the main range crossed, and access at once obtained from the coastal districts to the rich inland slope, a startling result when compared with the years of labour and baffled hope wasted on the Blue Mountains before victory was won. In the following year, 1829, Cunningham went on his last expedition, to the source of the Brisbane River, and this work concluded 10 years of constant and unceasing labour in the cause of exploration. He died in Sydney 10 years afterwards, on the 27th of June, leaving behind an undying name, both as a botanist and ardent explorer. During his own travels, and whilst sailing with Captain King, he had seen more of the continent than any man then living. Captain Charles Sturt of the 39th Regiment. What visions are conjured up when this name comes on the scene! Cracked and gaping plains, desolate, desert and abandoned of life, scorched beneath a lurid sun of burning fire, waterless, hopeless, relentless and accursed. That is the picture he draws of the great interior. He had followed up Oxley's footsteps and exposed the fallacies into which that explorer had fallen, and erred just as egregiously himself. True, like Oxley, he was the sport of the seasons. Oxley had followed the rivers down when year after year the regular rainfall had made them navigable for his boats, and had finally lost them in oceans of reeds. Sturt came when the land was smitten with drought, and the rivers had dwindled down to the thinnest trickle. Quote, "In the creeks weeds had grown and withered, and grown again, and young saplings were now rising in their beds, nourished by the moisture that still remained. But the large forest trees were drooping, and many were dead. The emus, with outstretched necks, gasping for breath, searched the channels of the rivers for water in vain, and the native dog, so thin that he could hardly walk, seemed to implore some merciful hand to dispatch him." End quote. Such was Sturt's description of the state of the country. In 1828, the year that witnessed his first expedition, no rain had fallen for 2 years, and it seemed as though it would never fall again. The thoughts of the colonists turned to that shallow ocean of reeds to the westward wherein Oxley had lost the Macquarie, and it was thought that now would be the time to verify its existence or find out what lay beyond. Captain Sturt was appointed to take command, and with him went Hamilton Hume, who had so successfully crossed to Port Phillip. The party consisted, besides of 2 soldiers and 8 prisoners of the Crown, 2 of whom were to return with dispatches. They had with them 8 riding and 7 pack horses, 2 draft and 8 pack bullocks. They had also with them a small boat rigged up on a wheeled carriage. It would be uninteresting to follow the party over the already known ground to Mount Harris, where Oxley had camped in 1818. This place Sturt and his men reached on the 20th of December, 1828. Quote, "As soon as the camp was fixed, Mr. Hume and I rode to Mount Harris, over ground subject to flood and covered for the most part by the polygonum, being too anxious to defer our examination of the neighbourhood even a few hours. Nearly 10 years had elapsed since Mr. Oxley pitched his tents under the smallest of the 2 hills into which Mount Harris is broken. There was no difficulty in hitting upon his position. The trenches that had been cut round the tents were still perfect, and the marks of the fireplaces distinguishable. While the trees in the neighbourhood had been felled, and round about them the staves of casks and a few tent pegs were scattered. Mr. Oxley had selected a place at some distance from the river, on account of its then swollen state. I looked upon it from the same ground and could not discern the waters in the channel, so much had they fallen below their ordinary level. On the summit of the great eminence which we ascended, there remained the half-burnt planks of a boat, some clenched and rusty nails and an old trunk, but my search for the bottle Mr. Oxley had left was unsuccessful. A reflection arose to my mind. On examining these decaying vestiges of a former expedition, whether I should be more fortunate than the leader of it, and how far I should be enabled to penetrate beyond the point which had conquered his perseverance. Only a week before I left Sydney I had followed Mr. Oxley to the tomb, a man of uncommon quickness and of great ability. The task of following up his discoveries was not less enviable than arduous, but arrived at that point at which his journey may be said to have terminated, and mine only to commence, I knew not how soon I should be obliged, like him, to retreat from the marshes and exhalations of so depressed a country. My eye turned instinctively to the northwest, and the view extended over an apparently endless forest. I could trace the river line of trees by their superior height, but saw no appearance of reeds, save the few that grew on the banks of the stream." End quote. Satisfied, after consultation with his companion Hume, that there was no obstacle to their onward march, they left their position, intending, as Sturt says, to close with the marshes. The night of the first day found them camped amongst the reeds, which they came upon sooner than they expected, and the next day they halted for the purpose of preparing the dispatches for the governor. On the morning of the 26th, the journey was resumed, the 2 messengers leaving for Bathurst, the rest proceeding onward until checked by finding themselves in the great body of the marsh, which spread in boundless extent around them. Quote, "It was evidently lower than the ground on which we stood. We had, therefore, a complete view of the whole expanse, and there was a dreariness and desolation pervading the scene which strengthened as we gazed upon it." End quote. Under the circumstances, an advance with the main body of the party was considered unwise, and it was determined to launch the boat and try and follow the course of the river, whilst a simultaneous attempt was made to penetrate the reed bed to the north. Accordingly, Sturt, with 2 men, started in the boat, and Hume and 2 more struck north. Sturt's boating expedition came very quickly to a close. In the afternoon of the day he started. Quote, "The channel which had promised so well without any change in its breadth or depth ceased altogether, and while we were yet lost in astonishment at so abrupt a termination of it, the boat grounded." End quote. All search was fruitless, and mysteriously and completely baffled as Oxley had been, so was his successor, and there was nothing for it but to return to camp. Hume had been more successful. He reported finding a serpentine sheet of water to the northward, which he did not doubt was the channel of the river. He had pushed on, but was checked by another of the seemingly inevitable marshes. On the 28th, the camp was shifted to this lagoon, and the boat was launched once more, without result. The new-found channel was soon lost in reeds and shallows. Forced to halt again, Hume went to the northeast to scout, and Sturt went northwest, each accompanied, as before, by 2 men. They left the camp on the last day of the year. After sunset on the first day, Sturt struck a creek of considerable size leading northerly, having good water in its bed. The next day, after passing through alternate plain and brush for 18 miles, a second creek was found, inferior to the first, both in size and the quality of the water. It too ran northerly. Crossing this creek after a short halt, they travelled through stony ridges and open forest, and at night camped on the edge of a waterless plain after a hot and thirsty ride. Here one of the men, noticing the flight of a pigeon, found a small puddle of rainwater that sufficed them. Next day, the country steadily improving in appearance, they made west by south for an isolated mountain with perpendicular sides, from the top of which Sturt trusted to see something hopeful ahead. He was disappointed. The country was monotonous and level, and no sign of river could be seen. They camped that night at a small swamp, and next morning Sturt turned back, like Oxley, coming to the conclusion that, quote, "Yet, upon the whole, the space I traversed is unlikely to become the haunt of civilized man, or will become so in isolated spots as a chain of connection to a more fertile country, if such a country exists to the westward." End quote. Hume had not returned when the party reached the main camp on the 5th of January. The next day he made his appearance. He reported having travelled on various courses about 30 miles north-northwest over an indifferent country. He had anticipated meeting with the Castlereagh, but had been forced to conclude that that river had taken a more northerly course than Mr. Oxley had supposed. He went westward and across fine, far-reaching plains, but saw no sign of the Macquarie River having reformed, crossing nothing but small creeks or chains of ponds. Most of the men, including Hume, complaining of sickness. The camp was shifted 4 miles to the north on to a chain of ponds reported by Hume. This creek they followed down when it disappointed them by disappearing in the marsh. Without water, they continued skirting the low country until fatigue compelled them to stop, when, by digging shallow wells in the reeds, they obtained a small supply. From here they made their way by a different route to the hill that had terminated Sturt's late trip, and which he had christened Oxley's tableland. Here they rested a few days, and Sturt and Hume, with 2 men, made another excursion westward, but without result. Their only resource now was to make north to a creek that they had followed down on their way to Oxley's tableland and see where it would lead them. On the 31st of January they came upon this creek, which was called by them New Year's Creek, now the Bogan, and the next day they suddenly found themselves on the brink of a noble river. Quote, "The party drew up upon a bank that was from 40 to 45 feet above the level of the stream. The channel of the river was from 70 to 80 yards broad and enclosed an unbroken sheet of water, evidently very deep, and literally covered with pelicans and other wild fowl. Our surprise and delight may better be imagined than described. Our difficulties seemed to be at an end, for here was a river that promised to reward all our exertions, and which appeared every moment to increase in importance to our imaginations. Coming from the northeast and following to the southwest, it had a capacity of channel that proved that we were as far from its source as from its termination. The paths of the natives on either side of it were like trodden roads, and the trees that overhung it were of beautiful and gigantic growth. The banks were too precipitous to allow of our watering the cattle, but the men descended eagerly to quench their thirst, which a powerful sun had contributed to increase. Nor shall I ever forget the cry of amazement that followed their doing so, or the looks of terror and disappointment with which they called out to inform me that the water was so salt as to be unfit to drink. This was indeed too true. On tasting it, I found it extremely nauseous, and strongly impregnated with salt, being apparently a mixture of sea and fresh water. Our hopes were annihilated at the moment of their apparent realization. The cup of joy was dashed out of our hands before we had time to raise it to our lips." End quote. Finding fresh feed lower down the river, the party halted for the benefit of the cattle, who, unable to drink the water, soaked their bodies in it. Meantime, although the tracks of the natives were abundant, they looked in vain for any of them. Fortunately, that night Hume found a pond of fresh water, and the party were refreshed once more. The phenomena of the salt river was puzzling to Sturt, though too familiar now to excite wonder. The long-continued drought having lowered the river so that the brine springs and the banks preponderated over the fresh water was of course the explanation, and it is a common characteristic of inland watercourses. The size of the river and the saltness of its water, however, partly convinced Sturt that he was near its confluence with an inland sea. So, for 6 days they moved slowly down the river, finding, however, no change in its formation, until the discovery of a saline spring in the bank convinced the leader that the saltness was of local origin. Leaving the party encamped at a small pool of fresh water, Sturt and Hume pushed ahead to look for more, but without success. Before leaving, they were startled one afternoon by a loud report like a distant cannon, for which they could in no way account, as the sky was clear and without a cloud. These strange reports have since been frequently heard, often at the same moment, at places more than 100 miles apart. The cause is generally ascribed to atmospheric disturbances. The advance was now checked. No fresh water could be found on ahead, and their animals were weak and exhausted. Sturt christened the river the Darling, and gave the order to retreat. As they again approached Mount Harris on the Macquarie, where they expected to find a relief party with fresh supplies, fears began to be entertained regarding the safety of those who might be awaiting them at the depot. The reed beds were in flames in all parts, and the few natives they met displayed a guilty timidity, and one was observed with a jacket in his possession. Their fears were, however, fortunately vain. The natives had made one attempt to surprise the camp, but had been frustrated, and the relief party had now been some 3 weeks awaiting the return of the explorers. Sturt rested for some days, during which time Hume made a short western trip to the south of the marshland. He reported that for 30 miles the country was superior to anything they had yet seen, and exceedingly well watered. Beyond that distance, the plains and brush of the remote interior again resumed their sway. On the 7th March, the party struck camp and made for the Castlereagh, the relief going back to Bathurst. On the 10th, they reached the Castlereagh and found it apparently without a drop of water in its bed. From here downwards the old harassing hunt for water commenced once more, and as they descended the river they were further puzzled by the intricate windings of its course and the number of channels that intersected the depressed country they were travelling through. On the 29th they again struck the Darling, 90 miles above the spot where they had first discovered it. Quote, "This singular river still preserved in its character so strikingly that it was impossible not to have recognised it in a moment. The same steep banks and lofty timber, the same deep reaches alive with fish were here visible as when we left it. A hope naturally arose to our minds that if it was unchanged in other respects it might have lost the saltness that rendered its waters unfit for use. But in this we were disappointed. Even its waters continued the same." End quote. Fortunately, the adventurers were not this time in such unhappy straits for water as before, so that the disappointment was less intense. Knowing what they might expect if they followed the Darling down south, the party at once halted. It was evident that to the east and northeast the rigorous drought had put its mark on the land, from the fact that large bodies of natives driven in from that direction were congregated round the few permanent waters left. A reconnoitring expedition across the Darling to the northwest was accordingly determined on to see if any advance into the interior was possible, and after a camp had been formed, Sturt and Hume started on the quest. No encouragement to proceed resulted. By 4 p.m. they found themselves on a plain that stretched far away and bounded the horizon. Quote, "It was dismally brown. A few trees only served to mark the distance. Up one of the highest I sent Hopkins on, who reported that he could not see the end of it, and that all around looked blank and desolate. It is a singular fact that during the whole day we had not seen a drop of water or a blade of grass. To have stopped where we would, therefore, have been impossible. To have advanced would probably have been ruin. Had there been one favourable circumstance to have encouraged me with the hope of success, I would have proceeded. Had we picked up a stone as indicating our approach to high land, I would have gone on, or had there been a break in the country or even a change in the vegetation, but we had left all traces of the natives behind us, and this seemed a desert they never entered, that not even a bird inhabited. I could not encourage a hope of success, and therefore gave up the point, not from want of means, but a conviction of the inutility of any further efforts. If there is any blame to be attached to the measure, it is I who am in fault. But none who had not like me traversed the interior at such a season would believe the state of the country over which I had wandered. During the short interval I had been out, I had seen rivers cease to flow before me, and sheets of water disappear, and had it not been for a merciful providence should, her reaching the Darling, have been overwhelmed by misfortune. I am giving no false picture of the reality. So long had the drought continued that the vegetable kingdom was almost annihilated, and minor vegetation had disappeared." End quote. Once more the order to retreat from the inhospitable Darling was given, and the weary march home recommenced. On their way they traced and followed a defined channel or depression formerly crossed by Hume, and ascertained it to be the outflow of the Macquarie marshes. On the 7th of April 1829 they reached Mount Harris. The mystery of the Macquarie was now to a certain extent cleared up, but there still remained another riddle to solve in the course and outlet of the Darling. Sturt, the discoverer of this river, was destined to find the answer to this problem as well. We have now traced the gradual extension of exploration to the westward, and seen a river system growing up, as it were, piece by piece, as the result of these expeditions. It may, therefore, be as well to continue to follow up Captain Sturt's expeditions, and note how the Murray and its tributary streams were gradually elaborated before touching upon events at this time occurring afar on the southwest coast of the continent. The desire to ascertain the course of the Darling naturally became a subject of great interest so soon as the result of Captain Sturt's expedition was known, and the Macquarie and Lachlan rivers having failed to afford a means of reaching the interior, it was determined to try the Morumbidgee. The fact that this river derived its supply from the highest known mountains and was independent to a large extent of the periodical rainfall was a great inducement to hope for success. Almost exactly a year after he had started on his journey down the Macquarie, Captain Sturt left Sydney on his Morumbidgee expedition on the 3rd of November, 1829. Hume was not on this occasion able to accompany the party, his own affairs on his farm needing his attention. Doubtless in spirit he was often with them, and it would have been but fitting had the discoverer of the Murray or Hume been one of the party to first trace its downward course. In Hume's place went George M. Lee, the son of the then Colonial Secretary Alexander M. Lee. With them also went Harris, Hopkinson, and Fraser, members of the Macquarie expedition. To our modern eyes, the appearance of the troop that marched out of Sydney early that summer morning would have looked strange indeed. Quote, "At 7:15 the party filed through the turnpike gate, and thus commenced its journey with the greatest regularity. I have the scene even at this distance of time vividly impressed upon my mind, and I have no doubt the kind friend who was with me on the occasion bears it as strongly on his recollection. My servant Harris, who had shared my wanderings, and had continued in my service for 18 years, led the advance with his companion Hopkinson. Nearly abreast of them, the eccentric Fraser stalked along, wholly lost in thought. The two former had laid aside their military habits, and had substituted the broad-brimmed hat and the bushman's dress in their place. But it was impossible to guess how Fraser intended to protect himself from the heat or damp, so little were his habiliments suited for the occasion. He had his gun over his shoulder, and his double-shot belt as full as it could be of shot, although there was not a chance of his expending a grain during the day. Some dogs Mr. Maxwell had kindly sent me followed close at his heels as if they knew his interest in them, and they really seemed as if they were aware that they were about to exchange their late confinement for the freedom of the woods. The whole of these formed a kind of advance guard. At some distance in the rear the drays moved slowly along, on one of which rode the black boy. Robert Harris, whom I had appointed to superintend the animals generally, kept his place near the horses, and the heavy Clayton, my carpenter, brought up the rear." End quote. It will be needless to follow the progress of the party through the settled districts that now extended to the banks of the Morumbidgee. On the 27th, we find them preparing to start from Mr. Warby's station, the last outpost of civilization. From thence they followed the river down, maintaining constant and friendly intercourse with the natives on the banks. For some time they passed through rich available country, and at one point they made a slight excursion to the north to connect with Oxley's most southerly limit. Although they did not actually verify it, Sturt was of the opinion that they were within at least 20 miles of the range seen by Oxley. Still, following the river, they now found its course leading them amongst the plains and flat country with which they were so well acquainted, and naturally travelled in the constant dread of the stream conducting them to the lame and impotent conclusions of the Macquarie and Lachlan. Quote, "Our route was over as melancholy a tract as ever was travelled. The plains to the north and northwest bounded the horizon. Not a tree of any kind was visible upon them. It was equally open to the south, and it appeared as if the river was decoying us into a desert, there to leave us in difficulty and in distress." End quote. Sturt now was constantly haunted with the thought of once more finding himself baffled and perplexed in some vast region of flooded country, without a defined system of channels. Every time he looked at the river he imagined that it had fallen off in appearance, feeling certain that the flooded spaces over which he was travelling would soon be succeeded by a country overgrown with reeds. The flats of Polygonum stretched away to the northwest and to the south, and the soil itself bore testimony to its flooded origin. Some natives here met with spoke of the cholera, a name which Sturt had heard before, and which he took to mean the Lachlan, from the direction in which the blacks pointed. These men indicated that they were but 1 day's journey from it. Sturt and Imlay, therefore, rode to the north to examine the country. They found a creek of considerable size, and from its appearance and the nature of the surrounding flats, deemed it to be similar channel from the Lachlan marshes to the Morumbidgee, as the one Sturt and Hume had formerly noticed to the north, leading from the great marsh of the Macquarie to the Darling. In point of fact, they actually crossed the Lachlan, and went some distance beyond it, passing close to Oxley's lowest camp, as the natives afterwards testified to Major Mitchell. The extract from the Major's journal bearing on the subjects runs thus. Quote, "The natives further informed me that 3 men on horseback who had canoes on the Morumbidgee had visited the Lachlan thereabouts since, and that after crossing it and going a little way beyond they had returned." End quote. Sturt mentioned seeing the fires of the natives during this trip, but he did not see them, although it was evident that they had a good look at him. On the 26th of December it seemed that their gloomiest hopes were to be realised. Traversing plains like those described before, Sturt says, quote, "The wheels of the drays sank up to their axle trees, and the horses above their fetlocks at every step. The fields of Polygonum spread on every side of us like a dark sea, and the only green object within range of our vision was the river line of trees. In several instances, the force of both teams was put to one dray to extricate it from the bed in which it had sunk, and the labour was considerably increased from the nature of the weather. The wind was blowing as if through a furnace from the north-northeast, and the dust was flying in clouds so as to render it almost suffocating to remain exposed to it. This was the only occasion upon which we felt the hot winds in the interior. We were, about noon, endeavouring to gain a point of a wood at which I expected to come upon the river again, but it was impossible for the teams to reach it without assistance. I therefore sent M. Lay forward with orders to unload the pack animals as soon as he should make the river, and send them back to help the teams. He had scarcely been separated from me 20 minutes when one of the men came galloping back to inform me that no river was to be found, that the country beyond the woods was covered with reeds as far as the eye could reach, and that Mr. Imlay had sent him back for instructions. This intelligence stunned me for a moment or two, and I am sure its effect upon the men was very great. They had unexpectedly arrived at a part of the interior similar to one they held in dread, and conjured up 1,000 difficulties and privations. I desired the men to recall Mr. Imlay, and after gaining the wood, moved outside of it at right angles to my former course, and reached the river after a day of severe toil and exposure at 5:30. The country, indeed, bore every resemblance to that around the marshes of the Macquarie, but I was too weary to make any further effort. Indeed, it was too late for one to undertake anything until the morning." End quote. The following day, accompanied by his friends, Sturt proceeded to examine the river. He found it still running strong without any sign of diminution in its flow, but the reedy flats were so dense and thick that no passage for the teams was practicable. At noon the leader halted and announced his intention of returning to camp. He had come to the determination to construct the whaleboat he had with him in sections, to send the teams back, and with 6 men and Mr. Imlay to start down the river, and follow it wherever it went. Whether ever to return again or not was for the future to determine. Clayton, the carpenter, was at once set to work upon the boat, or boats, for a tree was felled, a sawpit rigged up, and a small boat half the size of the whaleboat built. Everybody worked hard, and in 7 days the boats were afloat, moored alongside a temporary wharf, ready for loading. 6 men were then chosen to form the crew, who were about to undertake one of the most eventful and important voyages in Australia's history. They were Clayton the carpenter, Mulholland and McNamee, the 3 soldiers, Harris, Hopkinson and Fraser, the leader, and Lay. 8 in all. The remainder of the party under Robert Harris were to remain stationary 1 week in case of accident, then to proceed to Goulburn Plains and await instructions from Sydney. On the 7th of January 1830, the voyagers started, towing the smaller boat, the men all in high spirits at the wide prospect of adventure before them. Going with the stream, they made rapid progress, using only 2 oars. But the first day did not suffice to carry them clear of the reeds. In fact, at night when they landed to camp, they could scarcely find room to pitch their tents. On the second day, an accident happened to the skiff they were towing. She struck on a log and immediately sank with all the valuable cargo she carried. 2 days were spent in recovering the things, as the boat had gone down in 12 feet of water, and during the time they were so employed, the blacks robbed the camp of many articles. Once more on the move, they found the river still winding its way through a flat expanse of reeds, and threatening to end as the other rivers had done. On the afternoon of the next day, a change for the better took place. The reeds on both sides of the river terminated, and the country became more elevated, and bore the appearance of open forest pasture land. A tributary creek of considerable size joined the river from the southeast, and the spirits of the voyagers rose again. More tributaries now came in from the southeast, and the dangers of navigation increased, the river being full of snags and fallen timber, and the utmost care had to be used to keep the boat clear. On the second day of this distressing work, they were destined to meet with a surprise. Quote, "About 1 we again started. The men looked anxiously ahead, for the singular change in the river had impressed on them the idea that we were approaching its termination, or near some adventure. On a sudden, the river took a general southern direction, but in its tortuous course swept round to every point of the compass with the greatest irregularity. We were carried at a fearful rate down its gloomy and contracted banks, and in such a moment of excitement had little time to pay attention to the country through which we were passing. It was, however, observed that the Chalybeach springs were numerous close to the water's edge. At 3 p.m. Hopkinson called out that we were approaching a junction, and in less than a minute afterwards we were hurried into a broad and noble river. It is impossible to describe the effect of so instantaneous a change upon us. The boats were allowed to drift along at pleasure, and such was the force with which we had been shot out of the Morumbidgee that we were carried nearly to the bank opposite its embouchure, whilst we continued to gaze in silent astonishment on the capacious channel we had entered. And when we looked for that by which we had been led into, we could hardly believe that the insignificant gap that presented itself to us was indeed the termination of the beautiful and noble stream whose course we had thus successfully followed." End quote. Sturt had now succeeded beyond his hopes. His bold adventure had been rewarded even sooner than he could have expected. He felt assured that at last he floated on the stream destined to bear him to the sea. The key to the river system of the southeast portion of the continent was in his grasp, and all former fallacies and fanciful theories were answered for good. The voyage down the Murray, as this river was named after Sir George Murray, then the head of the colonial department, now continued free from some of the difficulties that had beset them in the Morumbidgee. The natives again made their appearance, and were constantly seen every day, some betraying great timidity, others appearing more curious than frightened. 4 of these natives accompanied them for 2 days, during which time the explorers narrowly suffered wreck in a rapid in the river. They now approached the confluence of the Darling, although of course they were not then able to verify the supposition that it was their old friend. And at this point, one of the most singular adventures ever narrated in the intercourse with native tribes happened. The wind was fair, and with the sail set the boat was making rapid way when, at the termination of a long reach, they observed a line of magnificent trees of green and dense foliage. A large number of blacks were here assembled, and apparently with no friendly intentions, armed, painted, and shouting defiance. Anxious to avert hostilities, Sturt steered straight for them, thinking to make friends. But when almost too close to avoid a meeting, he could see that the matter was serious. The blacks had their spears poised for throwing, and their women were behind with a fresh supply. The sail was lowered and the helm put about, and the boat passed down the stream, the natives running along the bank, keeping pace with them, shouting and attempting to take aim. To add to their danger, the river shoaled rapidly, and a sand spit appeared ahead, projecting nearly 2/3 of the way across the channel. And on this spit the blacks now gathered with tremendous uproar, evidently determined to make an assault on the boat as she ran the gauntlet through the narrow passage. Amongst the 4 blacks who had accompanied them for 2 days was one of superior personal strength and stature. These men had left the camp of the whites the night before, and it was believing in their presence in the crowd before them that led Sturt to disregard the hostile demonstrations. A battle now seemed inevitable. Arms were distributed to the crew and orders given to act when the emergency rose. We will let Sturt tell his own story. Quote, "The men assured me they would follow my instructions, and thus prepared, having already lowered the sail, we drifted onwards with the current. As we neared the sandbank, I stood up and made signs to the natives to desist, but without success. I took up my gun, therefore, and cocking it, had already brought it down to a level. A few seconds more would have closed the life of the nearest savage. The distance was too trifling for me to doubt the fatal effects of the discharge, for I was determined to take deadly aim in hopes that the fall of one man might save the lives of many. But at the very moment when my hand was on the trigger and my eye was along the barrel, my purpose was checked by Imlay, who called to me that another party of blacks had made their appearance upon the left bank of the river. Turning round, I observed 4 men at the top of their speed. The foremost of them, as soon as he got ahead of the boat, threw himself from a considerable height into the water. He struggled across the channel to the sandbank, and in an incredibly short space of time stood in front of the savage against whom my aim had been directed. Seizing him by the throat, he pushed him backwards, and forcing all who were in the water upon the bank, he trod its margin with a vehemence and an agitation that were exceedingly striking. At one moment pointing to the boat, at another shaking his clenched hand in the faces of the most forward, and stamping with passion on the sand. His voice, that was at first distinct, was lost in hoarse murmurs. 2 of the 4 natives remained on the left bank of the river. The 3rd followed his leader, who proved to be the remarkable savage I've previously noticed, to the scene of action. The reader will imagine our feelings on this occasion. It is impossible to describe them. We were so wholly lost in interest at the scene that was passing that the boat was allowed to drift at pleasure. We were again aroused to action by the boat suddenly striking upon a shoal which reached from one side of the river to the other. To jump out and push her into deep water was but the work of a moment with the men, and it was just as she floated again that our attention was withdrawn to a new and beautiful stream coming apparently from the north. A party of about 70 blacks were upon the right bank of the newly discovered river, and I thought that by landing amongst them I might make a diversion in favour of our late guest, and in this I succeeded. The blacks no sooner observed that we had landed than curiosity took the place of anger. All wrangling ceased, and they came swimming over to us like a parcel of seals. It was not until after we had returned to the boat and had surveyed the multitude on the sloping bank above us that we became fully aware of the extent of our danger, and of the almost miraculous intervention of Providence in our favour. There could not have been less than 600 natives upon that blackened sward." End quote. After presenting their friend who had acted so effectively on their behalf, and whose energetic conduct and prompt interference to preserve peace is unparalleled in native annals, with suitable gifts and refusing them to other chiefs, The boat's crew proceeded to examine the new river they had discovered at such a critical moment. Pulling easily up for a short distance, they found it preserved a breadth of 100 yards and a depth of rather more than 12 feet. The banks were sloping and grassy, crowned with fine trees, and the men exclaimed that they had got into an English river. To Sturt himself, the moment was a supreme one. Was it or was it not that mysterious darling whose course through the far interior had been a subject of speculation ever since its discovery? He felt sure that it was. Quote, "An irresistible conviction impressed me that we were now sailing on the bosom of that very stream from whose banks I had been twice forced to retire. I directed the Union Jack to be hoisted, and giving way to our satisfaction, we all stood up in the boat and gave 3 distinct cheers. It was an English feeling, an ebullition, an overflow, which I am ready to admit that our circumstances and situation will alone excuse. The eye of every native had been fixed upon that noble flag, at all times a beautiful object, and to them a novel one, as it waved over us in the heart of the desert. They had until that moment been particularly loquacious, but the sight of that flag and the sound of our voices hushed the tumult, and while they were still lost in astonishment, the boat's head was turned, and the sail was sheeted home. Both wind and current were in our favour, and we vanished from them with a rapidity that surprised even ourselves, and which precluded every hope of the most adventurous among them keeping up with us." End quote. Once more down the united streams of the Murray and the Darling, the party made rapid progress, landing occasionally to inspect the country, but finding always a boundless flat on either side of them. Provisions now began to get scarce with them. The barrels of salt pork that had been in the skiff when she sank in the Morumbidgee had their contents damaged by the admission of the fresh water. The fish, though abundant, were more than unattractive to their palates, and the men took no trouble to set the night lines. The strictest economy had therefore to become the order of the day. The skiff being only a drag to them, she was broken up and burnt for the sake of the nails and the ironwork. On the 24th of January, the whaleboat continued its voyage alone, and the record from day to day was only broken by their intercourse with the different tribes, with whom a regular system of communication was now established. Deputies were sent ahead from one tribe to another to prepare them for the visit of the strangers. These deputies, by cutting off the numerous bends of the river, were enabled to travel much quicker than did Sturt, frequently doing easily in one day what it took the boat two to accomplish. Their black friends were, however, becoming rather a nuisance. Little or no information could be obtained from them, and the constant handling and embracing, which they had from policy to submit to, became horribly distasteful to all of them, particularly as Sturt describes all the tribes he met with as being beyond the average filthily dirty and eaten up with skin diseases. On the 25th, the wanderers thought they sighted a range to the northwest, and the blacks confirmed it, pointing in that direction when Hopkinson piled up some clay in imitation of mountains. On the 29th, the leader calculated that they were still 115 miles from the coast, and as they had been now 22 days on the river, their return began to be a matter for serious thought. From what he saw of the country, Sturt imagined that it was, for the most part, barren and sandy, and would never be utilised. But, of course, he had little or no opportunities, travelling as he did, of forming a correct judgment. The cliffs on the riverbank now showed fossilised seashells in their strata. Chains of hills, too, became visible, and one of the natives, this old native, after the settlement of the country, was shot in cold blood by one of the South Australian police. An old man who had taken a strange fancy to Hopkinson described the roaring of the sea and the height of the waves, showing that he had visited the coast. None, it may be certain, were more glad than the leader to hear of their proximity, for his thoughts were always busy with the failing condition of his men and the accumulating difficulties of his return. True, it had been partly arranged that a vessel should proceed to the south coast, but Sturt had little hope of meeting her, even if one had been sent. The frequent bends in the river greatly delayed their advance, but they were cheered by the flight of seagulls over their heads. The river too widened day after day, and a constant strong wind from the southwest raised a chopping sea that almost stopped their way. The blacks they met all assured them that the ocean was at hand. On the 9th of February, Sturt, landing to examine the country, saw before him the lake that terminated the Murray. He had reached his goal 33 days after separating from his party at the Morumbidgee. Crossing the lake, the little band landed on the southern shore and ascertained that the communication between it and the sea was impracticable on account of its extreme shallowness. They found their position to be in Encounter Bay, east of Spencer's Gulf, and from what they saw it was evident that no ship could enter it during the prevalence of the southwesterly winds. All hope of a safe return centred in themselves. The thunder of the surf that they had so longed for brought no message of succour, but rather warned the lonely men to hasten back, while yet some strength remained to them. And above all, they were surrounded by hostile blacks. Sturt had now a terrible task before him. His men were weakened and on half rations. There was every probability that the fickle natives might be troublesome on their homeward route, and worst of all, they would have to fight the steady current of the river the whole way. Nor would their spirits be cheered by any hope of novelty or discovery. Under these gloomy auspices, Sturt re-entered the Murray on his return on the 13th of February. The homeward journey is simply a record of unrelaxed toil day after day, Sturt and him lay taking their turn at the oar like the rest, added to which the blacks gave them far more trouble than before. At the fall above the junction of the Darling, they once more met the friend who had saved them from coming into conflict with the natives on the 24th of January. He and some of his tribe assisted them to get the boat up the rapids. On the 20th of March, they reached the camp on the Morumbidgee from whence they had started, but it was now abandoned, and the hope that the relief party had pushed down there to meet them was destroyed. There was nothing for it but to pull on, but human nature was rapidly giving way. The men, though falling asleep at their oars, never grumbled, but worked steadily, if moodily, faithful to their duty to the last. Then the river rose, and for days they struggled vainly against it. One man went mad and had to be relieved from the oars. At last, when 90 miles from Morumbidgee, the place where Sturt believed the relief party to be camped, he determined to dispatch 2 men for provisions and await their return. After 6 days, when the last ounce of flour had been served out, the men came back with horses and drays, and all trouble was at an end. This was on the 18th of April, 88 days after their departure from the depot, during which they had voyaged 2,000 miles. This expedition, from whatever light it is regarded, either as the most important contribution ever made to Australian geography, or as an example of most wonderful endurance and patient heroism, is equally one of the most glorious records in this history. The leader and his men were alike worthy of each other. We have now had in review the opinion of many men on the future of the great interior, and seen how they all alike predicted for it barrenness and desolation. Even the satisfaction that Sturt felt at accomplishing the descent of the Murray was qualified by a consideration of the valueless country it flowed through. The question will naturally be asked, how could men of such ability and more than average shrewdness make such a gross mistake as the succeeding years have proved their opinion to be? The principal reason will be found in their want of experience in witnessing the development and improvement of land by stocking, and their ignorance of the value of the vegetation they condemned as worthless. Hume was the only man amongst them exceptionally fitted by training to judge of the capability of the land, and we do not often get at his direct opinion, Nor is it likely that, with the memory of the green meadowlands and sparkling waters of the Morumbidgee fresh in his mind, it would be a very favourable one. Oxley and Sturt both wrote smarting under disappointment, and both had been suddenly confronted with a new and strange experience which they could associate with nothing but the idea of a desert. That all this seemingly desolate waste should one day have a distinctive value of its own was what they could hardly dream of.